This week on Right Now, we focus on art and culture as a force for change. Artist and curator Alexander Heaton tells us about an exhibition of protest art he's putting on in London next month. Photojournalist Kerry Murray is in the Right Now studio telling us about the launch of his new media organisation, United Free Press. Author Allan Stevo tells us about his new book, Face Masks Hurt Kids. Actor, author and film producer Terry Stone talks to us about a new cryptocurrency he started to make it easier for independent films to get made. And finally, we screen the second episode of our series from investigative journalist Patrick Henningsen, giving us his analysis of Russia-Ukraine. Friday, 7 p.m. UK, Ickonic.com.
I had an idea about how the free press and how free journalists operated, and I looked at the mainstream. And what I noticed that we didn't have in the kind of alternative media or citizen journalism was really any kind of association or any kind of body that held us together. And so for me, looking around and noticing other citizen journalists like me being censored, being shut down, and being frankly ostracized from having any sort of platform, I felt that it would be the right time to start something new and to start a press organization of our own.
Is that something you think you can do then? It can almost protect, almost work almost like as a union, I guess, to help protect those journalists?
I hope so, yeah. And this is about protecting freedom of speech, right? It's not about protecting any particular narrative or any particular viewpoint. It's about protecting people's rights to report on the truth as they see it.
I mean, you're not from a journalistic background necessarily, are you? You've been thrust into this almost out of a sense of necessity.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I came to this from a corporate background, actually, and I've worked most of my career in the corporate world, certainly for the last 20 years at least. But always photography for me, and reportage photography particularly, has been an interest of mine in my private life. And you know, with the advent of the initial lockdown in March 2020, I started to ask myself, what could I do to contribute to this growing movement? And that was it.
It was great seeing you, I must admit, at those protests, because I remember thinking at the time, like, the mainstream media was just ignoring it. And so to actually see someone, and you always had press on your back, it was almost like, oh, okay, someone is covering it. Because, you know, as you've said, what you want to do with this movement is kind of provide some transparency and ask some questions, which the media haven't done for 2 years.
No, indeed, and that was one of the catalysts really for me getting involved in the photojournalistic side, but also in terms of the idea around the UFP was that I'd noticed, much to my dismay, that a lot of the hard questions that were on my mind and many others just weren't being asked by the mainstream media. In fact, I would say there had been a complete absence of any kind of challenge from what we saw coming out of Westminster.
Do you think art and creativity is a useful form of protest? Because you mentioned earlier about the giant syringes. I remember them. I was thinking them. I remember them in London.
Oh, that's cool that you remember them, yeah. I didn't get enough photos at the time. I wish I had. I think it does, yeah. I think actually, because if you're communicating something visually, you know, the image can reside with people. I've given up trying to wake people up in conversations anymore because it just doesn't work. It's almost better to have a sort of a nonchalant separation from people, like you're not trying to convince them that there's a medical martial law being imposed. But if you can put that in an image, and then there's something about the subconscious that images can go through, and the government's using all the propaganda of the subconscious visually when you look all over the buses, and the use of colour and mass formation psychosis, I think they call it. But I mean, we can do that with our own art. We can just be truthful in our own ways, in our own unique way. And I think it does help. And just showing beauty as well is very helpful. Showing a world, I mean, I've said to a lot of the artists in this exhibition that a lot of the artists want to define the problem, but the brief is open to people who want to envision what a better world would be like in their artwork. And some of them are just using geometry to say that. Some of my drawings are just geometry about purity of form and opening new dimensions, I suppose, not to be too metaphysical. But
if you want to make an independent film, you've got to find an investor that's willing to potentially lose everything. So, and there's obviously not many of them around. So, and what I've found is, again, as an independent producer, our most current film, which people will know, is Rise of the Foot Soldier Origins, and that was my first lead role. And I worked alongside Vinnie Jones and Keith Allen in that film. It's been a massive success at cinema, massive success on the digital. There's a thing called PVOD where you can watch it on Sky, you can watch it on Amazon, but it's obviously at a premium price. And then Amazon have just come in and bought that for 18 months exclusive. They outbid everybody for it because it's been such a success. So that made me think, well, look, this is all going digital anyway. So I thought, if I combine cryptocurrency with NFTs, so what we've done is we've launched FilmCoin. It's currently trading on 2 exchanges. There's one called FMFW, and there's another one called CoinStore in the Far East. And we're going to roll out on multiple exchanges, and we are going to actually fund the first film ever to be fully funded by crypto. So no one's ever done that in our space, and there's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is we want to create a digital film studio which essentially allows independent filmmakers like myself access to funding, and obviously to make it how I want it to be made. Because if you go to any broadcaster now, if you go to Amazon, if you go to Netflix, if you go to Sky, if you go to any Hollywood studio and you say, look, I want to make this film, they'll look at it and they'll say, well, we need you to tick all these boxes. And right. The problem is you then don't become independent. You're basically singing to their tune. So for me, this is a little bit of a movement, and it empowers creatives. Because the other thing is, if I make a film tomorrow and I sell the film, I've got to wait 6 months for my money. I've got to wait for the statements. The statements, unless you actually audit these people, you don't know if they're right.
Would you be able to give us, say 2 examples of reasons in your book that you can then just say to that person, just say, well, actually, you say it's safe and effective, here's why it's not?
It's important to recognize that there are lots of studies that show that the safe mask can be safe and effective. And these studies are almost all garbage. So just in 30 seconds, let me explain the difference between these 2 kinds of studies. There's these randomized controlled trials, and this says over a 6-month period of time, we followed this group of people, they masked with this amount of regularity, and at the end of it, we see that this group of people who masked had no difference in symptoms of viral contagion, viral infection, than this group of people who didn't mask. So that's like a randomized controlled trial is kind of, that's the structure that would be used there. And this science, the study I cite exactly, the Zhao study from the CDC, May 2020, this kind of science says no difference. And when there have been 14, up to that date, there have been 14 randomized controlled trials to that time. Just no difference between them. There's a different kind of study, a mechanistic study. The mechanistic study says things like, and everyone has seen this, and this is what the media kind of gloms onto, and and the political hacks glom onto them too. It's when you see smoke coming out of a face mask, that would be an example of a mechanistic study, and that's against the efficacy of face masks. But they say in theory, the face masks should be able to do this because of this particle size and that pore size and blah, blah, blah. And the mechanistic study simply says, in theory, that's what's going on. Well, every field from, plumbing to electronics to music has theory and has practice. And face masks are no different. So these randomized controlled trials are how ineffective they are.
We talk about politics a lot. And it's very much this binary kind of left or right, and you're very much cut down the middle and you either one or the other. Yeah. But interestingly, when you look at governments around the world, regardless of whether they've been left-leaning or right-leaning, we've seen a similar approach. To varying degrees, of course. Look at China, I think they probably have gone off on one end of the scale far too far. But when you look at it in the round, you notice that there have been lockdowns in more or less every Western country, certainly. There have been mask mandates in almost every country, certainly. And you have to ask, how have we all arrived at this point, and how has it happened at the same time? And so for me, that smacks of some sort of coordination. I don't know how integrated that coordination would be internationally, but it does look like a coordinated effort to do one thing. And so you have to ask a question about that. And I think, back to my original point, which was the absence of questions, or actually the absence of tolerating difficult questions. you know?
Yeah.
It's not even about being, or having a thought that you might query something. That's almost a crime in itself.
Yeah.
And that doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't sit well with a lot of people. I'm sure most people would agree that censorship for the sake of censorship is wrong.
Yeah, and it leads as well to self-censorship. You see a lot of that. I mean, there's certain instances where, you know, you will even hear people say, you can't say that. Well, did it happen or not?
Yeah.
Because if it did, I can say it. And that's how it should be in a free world with a free press, which is obviously what you're trying to create.
Yeah,
But
I
we're
think
not
as
there.
journalists, we have an obligation to share the truth.
Absolutely.
And to not be, whether intentional or otherwise, an agent of the state or a tool of the state. Yeah. It's the responsibility of the journalist, I think, to question the state, to question the government, and to question those bodies which would seek to somehow change the way we live or alter our lives or take away what many believe to be their fundamental freedoms.
We're just loosely talking about this concept of the awakening. And awakening or enlightenment has always been a great theme in art, you know, since the Enlightenment. And traditionally, you know, since the Renaissance, art was about uplifting the soul and the spirit. And it sounds a bit arrogant to say, you know, one is awake. But I think to say that we're awakening is sort of becoming more aware of the world that we've been living in, which is completely full of lies, and the powers that would like to be, how much control they have over. So it's really an invitation to all artists that are just starting that journey. And it's not judgmental saying, you know, you have to think that the virus came out of a lab or it's this or it's that. It's just people who are willing to challenge the narrative, because there's so much political correctness I've noticed in the art world. And there's so much fear to even speak out and say anything that's like not the sort of mainstream accepted narrative. So it's really just, an openness really to a fresh new look. And you might get a new paradigm of perception once you've freshened and opened your mind. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think that's what a lot of this is things? Obviously, we touched on really briefly a second ago about the fact that other people within your art community, haven't spoken out on these issues and have, obviously actively avoided them. And that, obviously, my experience is the same. But artists and creative people generally, I think, I thought before COVID, were more likely to see through the official version of things. But
that was what I thought.
Yeah, but then what you've just said there about the fact that they're maybe the political correctness, they're frightened. Maybe they do see through it a bit more than they let on. They're just too frightened to say anything.
I think definitely some of them do. I mean, my experiences with other artists that I've been in shared studios with them in the past, I did have some conversations with some of them, and some of them were aware, but some of them were very scared to do anything, to even go on a protest. There's a real climate of fear.
Face masks for kids. This is 8 months of work, and I dug into the science. I got over 800 scientific citations. Dug into the science of how a face mask is harmful for a child, and it's kind of neat because it's 500 pages, but 180 some chapters. I think 183 chapters. They're meant to be real quick, real easy to digest. So here. There's a chapter, Reason 45, Othering Children. Reason 54, Face masks hurt pregnant women and their babies. Each chapter is meant to be like a real careful meme. And you read 2 minutes into it, and you have everything you need. And you can really just, with 20 minutes of effort, you can take this book and you can just sit down with anyone who says, oh, I need to be wearing a face mask, I need to protect myself, it's so good for me. And you can say, well, what do you think about this chapter title? What do you think about this chapter title? And you can go through it with them and say, well, let's read this real quick. Now, what do you think about that? There's just no way with this book as a tool, if you have $20 and you have 20 minutes with this book as a tool, there's no way anyone can say to you again, face masks are safe and effective. It's just impossible to say. So you're going to, everyone's got their know-it-all sister, their know-it-all uncle, their know-it-all neighbor, there's something, and you're going to be hearing them for 30 years tell you about how, we did what we had to do, and face masks are necessary for the survival of the human race and things like this. And with that $20 and 20 minutes, you're gonna protect yourself. It's going to be an investment to stop you from 30 years of having to hear that nonsense about trust the science.
there's a narrative. You know, the narrative is this is what we want to push, and you know, it's a little bit like if you watch Rise of the Foot Soldier Origins as an example. In that film, it is very violent. There is lots of swearing in it. It isn't politically correct, you know, but that's obviously what's made it a success, because I think when you look at television and you look at films, you know, you can watch the you know, various films and television shows, and you can go, do you know something? I like this. And I think diversity, I think, you know, including people and obviously supporting people is important in film and television. But I think that what's happened is a lot of these people that are in the business, they've taken it too far. So rather than just saying, okay, you know, for me, I've always said, always get the best person for the job. There was a friend of mine who is an Oscar-winning director called Guy Nativ, and we're working on a film with him about the rise and fall of the Shah of Iran. And, you know, it's a fascinating story. It's never been done. And he recently made a film in London called Golda Meir. And Helen Mirren played Golda Meir. And you had Maureen Lipman coming out saying, you know, this is disgusting. She's not Jewish. You know, you should have a Jewish woman playing Golda Meir and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, you know, and then her response was, by that rationale, then you shouldn't have played any of the English parts then. You should only have played Jewish parts. And I think people take it too far. And I just think when you look at acting, you know, if you're playing a part, it doesn't matter. Yeah, obviously, if you was doing something controversial, like, you know, back in the day when you'd have these actors, you know, playing Indians and they were obviously white, things like that, obviously that's not acceptable now. But the actual thing that just because you're not from Iran, you can't play the Shah, or you're not Jewish, you can't play Golda Meir. To me, it's just political correctness gone mad.